When billionaire CEO Jackson Blackwell meets a mysterious flower seller in the rain, he never expects she's Charlotte Harris, the dead heiress whose parents are his clients. For 3 years, Charlotte has lived as Sophia Chen, hiding from Russian oligarch Viktor Kozlov, who wants her family destroyed. But when love blooms between two broken souls, they must risk everything to expose the truth and save her sister's life. Asterisk. Hey, Dignity Stories Z family, get ready. Today's tale is pure romance, dripping with secrets, surprises, and one twist you'll never see coming. Let's dive in. Asterisk. The rain fell like broken promises across Manhattan's financial district, each drop carrying the weight of another failed dream. Jackson Blackwell watched from his corner office on the 42nd floor as the city below dissolved into gray watercolor streaks. His reflection stared back from the floor-to-ceiling windows, a ghost in an expensive suit who had traded his soul for stock options and quarterly reports. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwell, the Harris family is here for the 4 o'clock meeting." Jackson's jaw tightened. The Harris family? 3 years of searching for their missing daughter had drained their fortune, and now they sat in his conference room, desperate for another loan against assets they no longer possessed. He straightened his tie and walked toward what he knew would be another conversation about hope dying slowly. 20 floors below, Sophia Chen pressed herself deeper into the doorway of an abandoned boutique, her flower cart the only splash of color in the monochrome afternoon. The wilted roses in her makeshift stand drooped like her shoulders, heavy with the weight of another day without sales. She pulled the threadbare jacket tighter around her frame, a garment that had once been designer, but now bore the stains of survival. She wasn't supposed to be here. Charlotte Harris was supposed to be planning charity galas and choosing between Harvard and Yale, not selling flowers to indifferent strangers who looked through her like she was made of glass. But Charlotte Harris had died in that car accident 3 years ago, or at least that's what everyone believed. What survived was Sophia, a girl who had learned that sometimes disappearing was the only way to stay alive. The rain intensified, and Sophia watched potential customers hurry past with newspapers over their heads. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion that had taught her to ignore weakness. She counted the crumpled bills in her jacket pocket. $12. Enough for a meal or a night in a shelter, but not both. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine purring like a satisfied predator. The door opened, and expensive Italian leather shoes hit the wet pavement. Sophia didn't look up at first. Rich people meant trouble in her experience. They saw homeless girls as either charity cases or invisible obstacles. But something made her raise her eyes. The man standing before her wore his wealth-like armor, all sharp lines and cold surfaces. His hair was dark and perfectly styled despite the rain, his coat probably worth more than she'd made in 6 months. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They weren't the eyes of someone who looked through people. They were the eyes of someone who saw too much for all of them. His voice cut through the rain's white noise. Sophia blinked. "What? The flowers? How much for everything you have?" She calculated quickly. $40. He pulled out his wallet without hesitation, extracting a $100 bill. "Keep the change." As he selected a bouquet of the least wilted roses, Sophia studied his profile. There was something broken in the set of his shoulders. Something that recognized the fractures in her own carefully constructed facade. "You're getting soaked," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "So are you." For the first time, his mouth almost curved into a smile. Almost, "I have somewhere warm to go." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sophia had learned to read the spaces between sentences, to hear the offers that weren't quite made. But this didn't feel like that. It felt like something else entirely. "So do I," she lied smoothly. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw a recognition flicker across his features. Not of who she was, but of what she carried. The same weight he dragged behind him like chains. "No," he said quietly. "You don't." Before she could respond, he shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric was still warm from his body, expensive and soft against her skin. She caught a hint of his cologne, something that smelled like cedar and secrets. "I can't take this." "You're not taking it. I'm giving it. He stepped back toward his car. There's a card in the pocket, if you need anything. He was almost to the driver's seat when she called out. Why? He paused, rain streaming down his face. Because someone should have done the same for me once. The sedan pulled away, leaving Sophia alone with his coat and a business card that read Jackson Blackwell, CEO Blackwell Industries. She turned the card over and found something handwritten. On the back, a phone number and 2 words that made her heart stop. Charlotte Harris. The penthouse apartment felt like a mausoleum of success, all marble surfaces and abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. Jackson stood in his kitchen, whiskey glass in hand, staring at the security footage he'd pulled from his buildings. Cameras. He'd enhanced the image of the flower girl's face until the pixels revealed what his instincts had already known. A Charlotte Harris, the missing daughter of his clients, supposedly dead for 3 years, very much alive and selling roses. In the rain, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You wrote my name on the card. How long have you known? Jackson set down his glass and typed back. How long have you been dead? The response came immediately. Long enough to prefer it that way. He stared at the screen, then typed. We need to talk. No, we don't. Your parents? Think you're buried in Riverside Cemetery. They've spent 3 years destroying themselves looking for a ghost. The silence stretched for 10 minutes before her reply came. Some ghosts should stay buried. Jackson walked to his window, looking down at the city lights blurring through the rain. He understood the desire to disappear, to shed your skin and become someone else entirely. He'd done it himself, in a way, when he'd buried the boy who used. To believe in things like justice and love, under the weight of corporate ambition. His phone rang. Her voice was different than he'd expected. Softer, but with edges that could cut glass. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me. Why would you care? You've got your good deed for the day. Rich man helps. Homeless girl, your conscience can rest easy? My conscience hasn't rested easy in 15 years. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. And you're not homeless. You're hiding. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd hung up. Then meet me tomorrow. The coffee shop on 5th and 42nd. Noon. Charlotte, Sophia. Charlotte died in that car. Don't bring her back. Die. The line went dead. The next day, Jackson arrived early and chose a corner table where he could watch the door. When she walked in, she looked different than she had in the rain. Her hair was clean, pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater that had seen better days but weren't quite threadbare. She moved like someone constantly calculating exit strategies. She slid into the seat across from him without ordering anything. You look exactly like your senior portrait, he said. You've seen my senior portrait? I've been managing your parents' accounts for 2 years. Your father shows everyone the photo he keeps in his wallet. Jackson studied her face. Same eyes. Same stubborn chin. Sophia's fingers drummed against the table. What do you want? The truth would be a good start. The truth. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is that Charlotte Harris was a naive little rich girl who believed her father when he said the family business was legitimate. The truth is that some mistakes get people killed, and sometimes staying dead is the only way to keep breathing. Jackson leaned forward. What kind of mistakes? The kind that involve federal investigations and witness protection programs that don't protect witnesses nearly as well as they promise? Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My father isn't just any businessman, Mr. Blackwell. He's been laundering money for people who don't believe in loose ends. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Jackson glanced around at the other customers, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Are you in danger right now? I've been in danger for 3 years. Every day I'm alive is borrowed time. Then why are you still here? Why didn't you disappear completely? Something flickered across her face. Vulnerability she couldn't quite hide. Because leaving the city would mean accepting that I'll never see them again. My parents, my sister, they're all I have left of who I used to be. Jackson understood. The mathematics of loss, the way love could become a chain that kept you tethered to places that could destroy you. He'd made similar calculations once, when walking away would have been the smart choice, but staying meant holding on to the last. Pieces of his humanity. There might be another way, he said carefully. Such as? What if Charlotte Harris came back from the dead? What if she had evidence that could put the people threatening her away permanently? Sophia's laugh was bitter. You think I haven't thought of that? You think I don't lie awake every night wondering if I could find a way back? I have no evidence, no proof, nothing but memories of conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. And even if I did, do you know what happens to people who testify against the Kozlov family? The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. Get Viktor Kozlov? He'd heard whispers about the Russian oligarch, who had his fingers in half the legitimate businesses in New York and all of the illegitimate ones. If the Harris family had gotten tangled up with Kozlov, Charlotte's disappearance suddenly made perfect sense. How much does your father owe them? $8 million. Last I knew. She met his eyes. Why? Jackson's mind was already working, calculating risks and possibilities. Because I might know someone who can help us get the evidence you need. But it would mean going back into that world. It would mean becoming Charlotte Harris again, at least temporarily. That's suicide. Maybe it's the only way to get your life back. Sophia stared at him for a long moment. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. Jackson thought about the boy he'd been before his own family. Had fallen apart before he'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to become someone else entirely. Because I know what it's like to lose yourself piece by piece, and I know what it's like to think there's no way back. She reached across the table and touched his hand, the first real human contact he'd had in months. What if we both end up dead? Then at least we won't die as strangers. Outside, the rain had stopped, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy staring into each other's eyes, recognizing something that went deeper than attraction, deeper than shared secrets. They were looking at their own reflections in another person's scars. Okay, she whispered, but if we're going to do this, we do it my way. And Jackson, when this is over, whether we succeed or fail, Sophia Chen disappears forever. I can't keep living between two lives. Jackson's penthouse had been transformed into a war room. Documents covered every surface. Laptops hummed with encrypted data. And surveillance photos of Viktor Kozlov's associates created a gallery of faces that could haunt nightmares. Stood at the window, watching the city wake up below. Wearing one of Charlotte Harris's dresses that Jackson had retrieved from her parents' house, the silk felt foreign against her skin, like wearing someone else's ghost. The plan is solid, said Marcus Chen, Jackson's head of security, and the only person they trusted with the truth. No relation to Sophia despite the surname she'd chosen, but he had the kind of quiet competence that made dangerous plans seem almost reasonable. Kozlov's hosting his annual charity gala tomorrow night. Half the city's elite will be there, including your parents. Sophia's reflection stared back at her from the window. 3 years of careful work to become invisible, and now she was about to walk into a room full of people who would recognize her instantly. What's our extraction plan if things go wrong? You don't want to know, Marcus said quietly. Jackson looked up from his laptop. What's that supposed to mean? It means if Kozlov figures out who she is, our best-case scenario involves federal witness protection in a place where winter lasts 9 months and the nearest neighbor is 50 miles away. In worst case? Sophia asked. Marcus and Jackson exchanged a look that told her everything she needed to know. The device is ready, Jackson said, changing the subject. He held up a piece of jewelry that looked like an expensive brooch, but contained enough recording technology to capture conversations from across a crowded room. You'll need to get close enough to Kozlov to activate it when he's talking business. The microphone has a range of about 20 feet. Sophia took the brooch, her fingers tracing its elegant curves. How close is close enough to get us both? Killed? Close enough to dance with him? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sophia had researched Viktor Kozlov extensively over the past 2 days. He was charming, ruthless, and had a reputation for collecting beautiful women. The way other men collected vintage cars, getting close to him wouldn't be the problem. Getting away would be. There's something else, Jackson said. Your parents can't know you're alive until after we have the evidence. A shock could give everything away. Sophia nodded, though. The thought of being in the same room as her family, without being able to speak to them, felt like a special kind of torture.
Al, what's my cover story?
Charlotte Harris rising from the dead tends to raise questions. You've been recovering in a private facility in Switzerland. Traumatic brain injury from the accident left you with amnesia. You only recently regained your memories? Convenient? Believable? Your parents will be so happy to see you, they won't ask too many questions, at least not immediately. Shh. Jackson's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. His face went pale. As he read it, "What is it?" Sophia asked. "Change of plans?" Kozlov moved up his timeline. "He's meeting with your father tonight. Some kind of final negotiation before tomorrow's gala." Marcus cursed under his breath. "That's not enough time to prepare properly. We don't have a choice." Jackson stood up, his mind already racing through contingencies. "Sophia, can you be ready in 3 hours?" She thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, polished and perfect and completely unprepared for the real world. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, scarred and cynical, but infinitely stronger. Charlotte Harris can be ready. The question is whether she can survive what comes next. 3 hours later, Sophia stood in the marble foyer of the Kozlov mansion, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The house was exactly what she'd expected from a man who owned half the city's politicians. Obscenely expensive and completely without soul. Crystal chandeliers threw rainbow fragments across walls lined with art that belonged in museums. She'd entered through the service entrance dressed as catering staff. But now she needed to transform back into Charlotte Harris. The bathroom, where she changed clothes, felt like a chrysalis, the place where Sophia Chen would shed her skin one final time. When she emerged, she was every inch the society princess she'd been born to be. The red dress Jackson had chosen fit perfectly. Her hair was swept into an elegant updo, and the recording device glittered innocently at her throat. She looked like money and breeding and everything Viktor Kozlov would want to possess. The main ballroom was already full of New York's elite, men in tuxedos and women dripping diamonds, all of them playing a game where the rules were written in blood and buried in Swiss bank accounts. Sophia spotted her parents across the room and had to grip the doorframe to keep from running to them. Her mother looked older, gray threading through her dark hair, while her father's face bore new lines that spoke of sleepless nights and guilt that wouldn't fade. Charlotte Harris. The voice behind her was accented, cultured, and made her skin crawl. "I was told you were dead." She turned to face Viktor Kozlov, and up close, he was even more dangerous than his photographs suggested. Tall and silver-haired, with eyes like winter mornings and a smile that had probably been the last thing dozens of people had ever seen. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," she said, extending her hand with practiced grace. He kissed her knuckles, his lips lingering a moment too long. "How fortunate for all of us. Your father will be so relieved. He's been quite distressed by your absence, has he?" She allowed just the right amount of confusion to color her voice. "I'm afraid the accident left me with some gaps in my memory. Perhaps you could help me understand what's been happening in my family's business while I've been away." Kozlov's eyes sharpened with interest. A beautiful woman with selective amnesia was either a gift from the gods or a trap set by his enemies. Either way, she had his attention. "Of course, my dear, but such conversations require privacy. Would you honor me with a dance?" As he led her onto the dance floor, Sophia activated the recording device with a touch that looked like nervous fidgeting. Kozlov's hand at her waist felt like a brand, marking her as his latest acquisition. "Your father owes me a considerable debt," he murmured, as they swayed to music that sounded like a funeral dirge. $8 million plus interest that accumulates daily. It seems like a lot of money. But I'm a patient man, especially when it comes to family matters. Your father has been most helpful in facilitating certain transactions. Through his shipping company, import and export can be such a complicated business. He spun her gracefully, and Sophia caught a glimpse of Jackson across the room. He was watching her with an expression that made her chest tight, something that went far beyond professional concern. "What kind of transactions?" she asked. "The profitable kind?" "Your father's ships provide a convenient way to move merchandise that might not pass traditional customs inspections. Art, antiques, various collectibles. The wealthy have such specific tastes. She knew he wasn't talking about art or antiques. The merchandise was drugs, weapons, and probably worse. Her father had turned his legitimate business into a pipeline for everything that made Viktor Kozlov rich and dangerous. And, if the debt isn't repaid, his grip on her waist tightened imperceptibly. Then I would be forced to collect collateral. Your family has such lovely assets. Your sister, for instance. Alina is quite beautiful, though not as striking as you. The threat was delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. But Sophia heard the steel beneath the silk. This was why she'd disappeared. This was why Charlotte Harris had to die, I see. She kept her voice steady through. Sheer force of will. And what would it take to clear this debt entirely? Complete cooperation. Your father continues to provide transportation services, and I consider the matter settled. Yeah. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. Of course, having you back adds certain possibilities to our arrangement. A beautiful woman can open doors that money cannot. The song ended, but Kozlov didn't release her. You know, Charlotte, I find it curious that you would appear tonight. It's just as your father and I were concluding our negotiations. Almost as if someone wanted you to hear this conversation. Sophia's blood turned to ice water. I don't understand. Oh, I think you do. His smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. Don't worry, my dear. I've always admired ambition, even when it's poorly executed. Across the room, she saw Jackson moving toward them, but two of Kozlov's men materialized to block his path. Her cover was blown, the recording device felt like a target painted on her chest, and the only exit was through a room full of people who would pretend not to see whatever happened next. Now, Kozlov said, his grip becoming painful, let's have a proper conversation about what you're really doing here. Viktor Kozlov's private study felt like a tomb carved from mahogany and lined with the bones of his enemies. Sophia sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars, her hands bound behind her back with zip ties that cut into her wrists. The recording device had been removed from her throat and now sat on Kozlov's desk like an accusation, its red light blinking steadily. 23 minutes of very interesting conversation, Kozlov said, examining the device. With the detached interest of a collector appraising a new acquisition, enough to put me away for several lifetimes if it were to reach the right ears. Jackson stood near the window, flanked by two men who looked like they crushed bones for recreation. His face was stone, but she could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate search for an angle they hadn't considered. The question, Kozlov continued, is what to do with my uninvited guests? Your little performance was quite convincing, Charlotte. Or do you prefer Sophia these days? How long have you known? She asked. Known what? That you were alive. I've known for 18 months that you were planning something foolish. Since about 10 minutes after you walked into this house. He opened a silver cigarette case, the metal gleaming like surgical steel. Did you really think you could simply waltz back into society and play detective? I have people watching your parents, your sister, even your old college roommate in Denver. The casual mention of Alina hit Sophia like a physical blow. You said you'd leave my family alone if I stayed dead. I said many things. The dead rarely return to collect on such promises. He lit his cigarette with a gold lighter that probably cost more than Sophia's entire 3 years of survival. Besides, you broke our agreement first. Charlotte Harris was supposed to stay buried. Jackson spoke for the first time since they'd been dragged into the study. What do you want from you? Nothing. You're merely collateral damage in someone else's poor decision. Kozlov's attention returned to Sophia. But from her, I want what I've always wanted. Complete cooperation from the Harris family business. Now, with the added incentive of their beloved daughter's safety, and if I refuse, then you join the ranks of people who thought they could outmaneuver me. Spoiler alert, it's a very short list because most of them are dead. Sophia looked around the study, noting the exits, the weapons, the way shadows fell across the room. 3 years of survival had taught her to assess every environment as a potential battlefield. But this wasn't a back alley or an abandoned building where she could disappear into the darkness. This was enemy territory. surrounded by armed guards and society's elite who would turn blind eyes to whatever happened behind closed doors. There is, however, an alternative, Kozlov said, as if reading her thoughts, which is to become my partner instead of my victim. A beautiful woman with your connections could be invaluable in expanding my operations. Think of it as a career change. Suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Sophia understood what he was really offering. She could trade her family's freedom for her own soul. It's become another of his collected assets, a weapon pointed at the heart of legitimate society. In Jackson, Mr. Blackwell presents a more complex problem. He knows too much to simply walk away, but killing a prominent CEO tends to attract unwanted attention. Kozlov stubbed out his cigarette in an ashtray made from what looked like fossilized bone. Perhaps he could be convinced to join our little enterprise as well. His financial expertise would be useful. Jackson's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. You want me to launder money for the man who's been destroying innocent families? I want you to survive the next 24 hours. Everything else is negotiable. A knock at the study door interrupted the standoff. One of Kozlov's men entered and whispered something in rapid Russian. Kozlov's expression shifted from amusement to concern to something approaching panic. It seems we have unexpected visitors, he said, his accent thickening with stress. Federal agents are at the front gate with search warrants. How unfortunate. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs. Either someone had called in the cavalry, or this was the worst possible timing in the history of rescue attempts. Marcus, Jackson said quietly, and Sophia understood. Marcus, Chen, Jackson's head of security, had been monitoring their mission. If they'd missed their check-in times, he would have activated their backup plan. Kozlov stood and straightened, his jacket transforming back into the polished businessman he pretended to be in public. Dmitri, take our guests to the wine cellar. If the federal agents find anything more incriminating than vintage Bordeaux, I'll hold you personally responsible. As the guards moved toward them, Jackson caught Sophia's eyes. The cellar has a service tunnel, he mouthed silently, nodded almost imperceptibly. He'd memorized the building's blueprints, just like she'd memorized every conversation she'd ever overheard about Kozlov's operations. They'd planned for this contingency, though she'd hoped it wouldn't come to underground escapes and federal raids. The wine cellar was exactly what she'd expected from a man who collected power like vintage bottles, rows of expensive alcohol that would never be consumed. Stored in a room that felt like a mausoleum. The guards zip-tied their ankles as well as their wrists, then positioned themselves at the only visible exit. The tunnel entrance is behind the 1947 Dom Perignon, Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of chaos filtering down from the house above. How do we get there with broken ribs and zip-tied limbs? Very carefully. What followed was 20 minutes of the most painful contortion Sophia had ever experienced. They worked back-to-back, using broken glass from a wine bottle Jackson had managed to knock over to cut through their restraints. Her wrists were bleeding by the time she got free, and Jackson's face was gray with pain from what were definitely cracked ribs. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall that opened with pressure applied to specific wine bottles. Jackson's intelligence had been accurate. But what he hadn't mentioned was that the tunnel was barely 4 feet high, flooded with 3 inches of standing water that smelled like decades of urban decay. They crawled through darkness that felt like being buried alive, guided only by Jackson's phone flashlight and the hope that Marcus's extraction plan was better than their infiltration strategy. Behind them, the sounds of the federal raid grew fainter, but Sophia knew this was far from over. Kozlov would survive the government investigation the way he'd survived all the others. Men like him always did. They emerged through a great inn. An alley 6 blocks away, gasping like drowning victims who'd found air. Jackson's shirt was soaked with blood from his ribs, and Sophia's dress was ruined beyond recognition. They looked like refugees from a war zone, which wasn't far from the truth. Marcus was waiting with a car, his face grim. We need to get you both to a hospital. And no hospitals, Sophia said. Too many records, too many questions. Then we go to the safe house. But first, you need to know something. Marcus looked between them, his expression grave. The federal agents didn't find anything. Kozlov's lawyers had them out of the house in 40 minutes. And Sophia, there's more. What? Your parents received a message an hour ago? Photos of you at the gala, along with a very clear threat. Either you surrender yourself by tomorrow night, or your sister Alina disappears permanently. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of hiding collapse around her like a house of cards. She'd tried to save her family, and instead had signed Elena's death warrant. Every decision she'd made, every sacrifice, every night, spent sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings, had led to this moment where love became a weapon pointed at the people she'd tried to protect. He knew, she whispered. From the beginning, he knew we were coming. This whole thing was a setup. Jackson's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers despite the blood and the pain, and the certainty that they were both probably going to die for their mistakes. Then we changed the game. How? We give him what he wants. You walk into his trap tomorrow night, and I make sure you walk back out. That's suicide. Maybe. But it's the only way to end this. His eyes met hers in the darkness of the alley, and she saw something there that made her chest ache. Besides, someone once told me that dying as strangers would be a waste. Above them, sirens wailed through the night, and Sophia realized that tomorrow would determine whether Charlotte Harris would finally come home, or whether Sophia Chen would die trying to save the people she loved most. The abandoned pier stretched into the Hudson River like a finger pointing toward oblivion. Fog rolled off the water in ghostly waves, muffling the sounds of the city and transforming the waterfront into something from another world. Sophia stood at the end of the pier, wearing the same red dress from the gala, now cleaned and mended, but still carrying the weight of everything that had gone wrong. Viktor Kozlov emerged from the fog like a well-dressed specter, flanked by 4 men who moved. With the predatory grace of professional killers, he'd chosen this location carefully. No witnesses, no surveillance cameras, no chance of federal intervention. Just water and darkness and the kind of silence that swallowed screams. Punctual as always, Charlotte. I do admire that in a woman. Where's Alina? Safe for now. He gestured, and one of his men produced a tablet showing live video feed. Alina Harris sat tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse, her eyes wide with terror but very much alive. She really is lovely. I can see why you'd want to protect. Her Sophia's hands clenched at her sides. 3 years of running, 3 years of carefully constructed identities and survival strategies, and it all came down to this. A choice between her own life and her sister's. You got what you wanted, she said. My parents' business, my cooperation, everything. Let her go. Oh, my dear girl. You still don't understand. Kozlov's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. I don't just want your cooperation. I want your complete submission. You see, you've caused me considerable inconvenience over the past few years. The federal investigation, the unwanted attention, the questions from associates who wonder if I'm losing my touch. That kind of damage requires a very public demonstration of power. Meaning you're going to disappear again, Charlotte, permanently this time. But not before you watch your sister pay the price for your rebellion. The words hit her, like physical blows. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it during the sleepless hours since last night's escape. But knowing and experiencing were different animals entirely. However, Kozlov continued, I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll give you a choice. You can die quickly and painlessly, and your sister lives. Or you can try to fight, and I'll make. Sure, she suffers before I kill her too. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Charlotte Harris had been naive and privileged, but she'd also been loved. Sophia Chen had been strong and resourceful, but she'd been alone. Neither identity had been enough to protect the people she cared about. There's a third option. The voice came from behind Kozlov, and Sophia's heart stopped as Jackson stepped out of the shadows. He was supposed to be at the safe house, wounded and recovering. He was supposed to be anywhere but here, Mr. Blackwell. How unexpected. Kozlov's men immediately raised their weapons, but he gestured for them to wait. I thought our business was concluded. Not quite. Jackson moved closer, his hands visible, but his posture suggesting a man who'd made peace with violence. You made one crucial mistake, Victor. You assumed this was about money, isn't everything? Not this. This is about family. Something you've never understood because you've never had anything worth dying for. Jackson reached into his jacket, moving slowly enough that the gunman didn't fire, but deliberately enough that everyone understood he was retrieving something important. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a phone, its screen glowing in. The fog-shrouded darkness. "That's a live feed," he said, holding the device so Kozlov could see. "Every word of this conversation is being broadcast to a secure server recorded in real time and automatically uploaded to 3 different news organizations and the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force." Kozlov's composure cracked for the first time since Sophia had known him. "You're bluffing." Marcus Chen, my head of security, is former NSA. He knows people who specialize in making sure evidence survives even if the witnesses don't. Jackson's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. "But here's the beautiful part, Viktor. I'm not here to arrest you or expose you. I'm here to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" "The kind where everyone walks away alive and you get something." "You want more than Charlotte Harris's death." Sophia stared at Jackson, her mind racing to understand his strategy. He'd positioned himself between her and Kozlov's men, close enough that any gunfire would hit him first. It was either brilliant or suicidal, and she couldn't tell which. "You have 10 seconds to explain before my associates start shooting," Kozlov said. "Blackwell Industries has been developing a new cryptocurrency exchange system, completely untraceable. Transactions impossible to trace through traditional banking systems. It could revolutionize money laundering for organizations like yours." Jackson paused, letting the implications sink in. "The technology is worth approximately $50 billion in the right hands. And you're willing to give me this technology in exchange for 2 lives? I'm willing to give you the patent and the source code in exchange for Charlotte and Elena Harris walking away from this permanently.
Oh.
No more threats, no more surveillance, no more games. They disappear from your world forever, and you get a tool that makes every other criminal enterprise in the world obsolete." Kozlov considered this, his predator's instincts warring with his businessman's greed. $50 billion was more money than most countries' GDP. It was the kind of power that could reshape entire criminal empires. "How do I know the technology works?" "Because I've been using it to move money out of your accounts for the past 6 months." Jackson's smile widened at Kozlov's expression. "Every time you thought you were investigating Charlotte Harris, every resource you devoted to tracking down Sophia Chen. I was systematically draining your offshore holdings and redistributing them to your victims' families." The silence stretched like a blade against skin. Sophia realized she was holding her breath, watching 2 master manipulators circle each other in a dance that would determine whether she lived or died. $30 million, Jackson continued conversationally. "That's how much I've stolen from you while you were playing games. The Harris family debt. I paid it off 4 months ago. Your leverage disappeared the moment you decided to make this personal instead of professional." Kozlov's hand moved toward his jacket, but Jackson was faster, not with a weapon, but with words that cut deeper than bullets. "Kill me, and the dead man's switch activates. Every financial record, every transaction, every piece of evidence about your operations gets released simultaneously to law enforcement agencies in 12 countries. You'll be dead or in prison within 72 hours, and if I let you walk away, then you get the technology. Charlotte and Elena disappear forever, and everyone pretends this never happened. Your choice, Viktor. Revenge or survival?" Kozlov stared at Jackson for a long moment, then at Sophia, then at the phone that was recording. Every word for posterity. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of pride against pragmatism. "The source code. And I want confirmation that the Harris family debt is cleared from my books permanently. Done. And if I ever see Charlotte Harris or Sophia Chen again, you won't," Sophia said, stepping forward. "Because both of those women are about to cease to exist." Jackson looked at her sharply, but she met his gaze with something that might have been peace. She'd spent 3 years running from Viktor Kozlov, 3 years trapped between 2 identities that neither one complete. But standing here, on this pier, Watching the fog swirl around them like smoke from a funeral pyre, she understood what she had to do. "My name is Catherine Blake," she said to Kozlov. "I'm a trauma counselor who specializes in helping people rebuild their lives after losing everything. Charlotte Harris and Sophia Chen were both patients of mine who died in the same car accident. 3 years ago, I've been pretending to be them as part of an elaborate psychological breakdown following my own family's death. It was a perfect lie, delivered with the kind of conviction that only came from someone who'd learned to survive by becoming other people." Jackson stared at her with something approaching admiration, while Kozlov's expression suggested he was trying to decide whether to believe her or kill her for the audacity of the performance. "Catherine Blake has no connection to your world," she continued. "She has no family for you to threaten, no past for you to exploit. She's going to leave New York tonight and never come back. The Harris family will never see their daughter again. But they'll believe she died peacefully in Switzerland, surrounded by medical professionals who cared about her recovery." "And what about him?" Kozlov gestured toward Jackson. "Mr. Blackwell and I never met. This entire conversation never happened. Everyone goes back to their lives, and Catherine Blake disappears into whatever life she chooses to build." The beauty of the lie was its simplicity. No loose ends, no ongoing threats, no reason for Kozlov to devote resources to tracking someone who didn't exist. Catherine Blake could be anyone, go anywhere, become whatever she needed to be. Kozlov nodded slowly. "Send me the technology." Jackson pulled out a different phone and began typing. Within moments, Kozlov's own device chimed with an incoming message. He spent several minutes reviewing code that probably looked like hieroglyphics to anyone who wasn't a criminal or a computer programmer. "This is legitimate," he said finally. "I don't make promises I can't keep." "No, but you do steal $30 million from people who don't forgive debts." Kozlov's smile was sharp, but it lacked the predatory hunger that had characterized all their previous interactions. "Fortunately for you, Mr. Blackwell, I admire competence. Consider the theft a fee for services rendered." He gestured to his men, who began moving back toward their vehicles. But he paused before disappearing into the fog. "Catherine Blake. Yes. If I ever discover that you're lying about who you are, if Charlotte Harris or Sophia Chen ever resurface, I will find you and make you regret every breath you've taken since this moment. Understood? Good. Enjoy your new life." He vanished into the fog like smoke, taking his men and his threats with him. The pier fell silent, except for the sound of water lapping against the pilings and the distant hum of city traffic. Jackson and Catherine stood alone in the darkness. Two people who'd just rewritten the rules of their entire existence. The fog swirled around them like a curtain falling on the final act of a play that had nearly ended in tragedy. "Catherine Blake," Jackson said finally. "It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? What happens now?" She looked out at the water, at the city. Lights reflecting off the surface like fallen stars. "Now Catherine Blake figures out how to build a life that belongs to her instead of borrowing pieces from people she used to be. And Jackson Blackwell goes back to being a cold CEO who occasionally does the right thing for reasons he doesn't entirely understand." She turned to face him, unless he wants to help Catherine Blake figure out what normal people do when they're not running for their lives or stealing from Russian oligarchs. Jackson stepped closer, close enough that she could see her reflection in his eyes. "I've never been normal. Neither have I. Maybe we can learn together." When he kissed her, it tasted like fog and freedom and the kind of hope that only came from surviving something that should have destroyed them both. They were two people who'd lost themselves completely and found each other in the wreckage. And maybe that was enough to build something real on. Behind them, the city hummed with 8 million lives being lived, most of them by people who would never know how close they'd come to witnessing a love story that began with rain and ended with rebirth. Catherine Blake and Jackson Blackwell walked off the pier together, leaving behind the ghosts of Charlotte Harris and Sophia Chen and the cold CEO, forgotten what it felt like to care about someone more than he cared about surviving. 3 months later, Alina Harris received a letter with no return address, postmarked from a city she'd never heard of. Inside was a photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like her dead sister, standing next to a man in what appeared to be a small-town coffee shop. The woman was laughing at something he'd said, her face bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you belong. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Some people get second chances. Love, your sister who learned to live again." Lena never showed the letter to her parents. Some gifts were too fragile for sharing, and some mysteries were more beautiful than their solutions. She kept the photograph in her jewelry box, next to a pair of earrings that had belonged to Charlotte, and sometimes she would look at it and smile, knowing that somewhere in the world, love had one. *Lee, if this story gave you chills, share with friends who love intense romance. Subscribe for more heart-stopping love stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Comment below. What would you sacrifice for the person you love? The end.